Never mistake silence for absence or humility for weakness. Some people aren't quiet, they're just heavily armed in the spirit. Listen carefully, because this ain't your regular message. This is for the chosen one who's been underestimated, misread and provoked, because they had no idea who you really were in the spirit. They thought you were just calm, passive, soft-spoken, maybe even weak. What they didn't realize is that they weren't dealing with a personality. They were bumping into ranked authority from the throne room of heaven itself. You weren't just vibing, you were enthroned. Here's a fact most people ignore. In the spiritual realm, rank isn't based on titles, followers, or family name. It's based on obedience, submission, and spiritual endurance. That's why the most dangerous people in the room are usually the quietest. They've fought battles no one saw and won wars that didn't make the news. And while they were busy throwing shade, you were collecting scrolls. While they schemed, you ascended. And when they finally tried to test you, let's just say the exam didn't go the way they planned. And honestly, somebody should have warned them, but they wanted smoke. Now they're coughing on holy fire. So let's talk about it. Let's expose what happens when people try to drag a divine general into petty warfare. Let's unpack what it means to be ranked in the spirit, and why provoking a chosen one is never just drama. It's a spiritual miscalculation with serious consequences. Ready? Let's go. Number 1. They judged the vessel and ignored the throne inside it. They judged you by what they could see, not what heaven had placed in you. They looked at your clothes, your job, your past, your silence, your circle or lack of one, and assumed you were ordinary. That was their first mistake. They didn't recognize your value because your anointing wasn't wrapped in status or spotlight. You weren't loud about it, you weren't flashy, and that confused them. Because the world teaches people to equate visibility with importance. But spiritual rank doesn't wear labels, it wears scars. They thought you were someone they could play with, compete with, manipulate, or dismiss. They saw the vessel, but they didn't discern the throne sitting inside it. The throne that didn't come from human hands. The throne that was built through seasons of crushing, divine tests, isolation, and obedience when nobody was watching. They didn't see your private battles. They didn't feel your midnight wrestles with God. They weren't there when heaven stretched you in silence and made you bleed in prayer. So they assumed wrong. When someone is spiritually ranked, God doesn't advertise it, He hides it. Because real power doesn't need applause. It moves in authority. You were walking around like a regular person, but spiritually, you were carrying the weight of kingdom territory. And that's the thing. They weren't just underestimating you, they were mishandling what you carry. They touched something sacred without knowing. Number 2, your stillness was mistaken for weakness. But it was military precision. They thought you were slow to react because you were scared or unsure. They didn't realize you were trained by heaven not to move off emotions, but off divine timing. You weren't frozen, you were calculating. You were waiting on a spiritual green light that they don't even believe in. You've learned the hard way that jumping too soon can cost more than staying still. So when they came for you, tested you, provoked you, and expected you to explode, you didn't. And that silence drove them mad. But what they saw as passivity was actually precision. People who operate from the flesh always expect fast reactions. They live in chaos. But you've been forged in a different environment. You know how to sit in the tension. You know how to hold your peace, even when everything inside of you wants to defend yourself, clap back, or expose the lie. Why? Because you've been trained not to fight battles you haven't been cleared for. You've seen what happens when you step out of position just to prove a point. You've watched people lose spiritual ground because they let ego lead instead of discernment. They called you weak because you didn't match their drama. They called you soft because you didn't curse them back. They called you confused because you moved slowly, but really you were scanning the spirit. You were waiting on divine strategy. You weren't panicking, you were positioning. Because when you move, things shift. When you speak, things break. When you pray, things change. You're not just responding, you're launching heaven-backed counterattacks. The ones who tested you didn't realize they were poking someone trained for war. A war not of fists, but of precision. You're not afraid to fight, you're just wise enough to wait. Because you don't throw punches randomly anymore. You wait, aim, and let God set the target. Number 3, they invoked warfare without knowing you were cleared for counterattack. They came for you like it was just another petty game, through gossip, jealousy, manipulation, maybe even spiritual warfare your way, thinking it would land like it always does on others. They had no idea they were triggering something far beyond their understanding. You're not just protected, you're cleared for counterattack. There's a difference between someone who's spiritually covered and someone who's been authorized to respond with divine force. You're the latter. What they didn't know is that the moment they launched that attack, they stepped into a realm where you've been given legal access to respond, not out of revenge, but from righteous authority. You're not passive, you're not helpless. You've just been trained to let heaven strike first. And when God says move, you don't come with chaos, you come with consequence. They thought your silence was retreat, but it was strategy. They thought you being quiet meant they'd won, but they didn't know you were listening for heaven's instruction. Because when you're spiritually ranked, you don't just fight, you enforce. What's wild is that they genuinely believed they could throw curses, word attacks, or sabotage into your space and walk away untouched. That's how little they understood spiritual law. They didn't realize that touching someone who's been sealed by God has repercussions. Not because you're special in a prideful sense, but because your life is aligned. You're not out here playing games with God, you're submitted. You've been through fire and He trusts you. That's why He gives you the authority to act when provoked, not for ego, but for justice. So when they tested you, they triggered something divine. And now they're seeing backlash they can't explain. Peace turning into pressure, plans falling apart. Spiritual interference that makes no sense. That's not karma. That's spiritual consequence. That's what happens when someone throws darkness at a vessel that's been marked by light. And now they're learning the hard way. This wasn't just personal. This was spiritual. And you don't attack a divine one and walk away clean. Number 4, you were spiritually ranked above them, but chose to move among them silently. You were never in their league, but you didn't need them to know that. You weren't walking around demanding recognition or shouting about your calling. You weren't loud because true authority doesn't need volume. You didn't come to impress, you came to obey. And in obedience, God had you moving low, quiet, unseen, not because you lacked power, but because your assignment required disguise. You weren't hiding out of fear, you were hidden on purpose. While they were busy chasing platforms, showing off titles and measuring clout, you were on a different mission. You weren't interested in proving spiritual maturity to people still controlled by their egos. You didn't come to play the "look how anointed I am" game. You knew your rank wasn't up for debate. It was sealed by heaven long before they even knew your name. So you moved like someone who didn't need external validation, even though you carried internal fire. And still, they took your quietness for smallness. They saw your humility and mistook it for a lack of power. But you were never small. You were strategic. You knew the weight you carried. You knew the authority heaven had given you, but you also knew when to speak, when to move, and when to let ignorance run its course. Then came the moment, the challenge, the disrespect, the spiritual test. And that's when the shift happened. The very realm they didn't believe in stood to attention. The air changed. The atmosphere responded. What they thought would break you instead exposed them. They stirred something they weren't prepared for, because when someone with true spiritual authority gets activated, things around them respond. Not with noise, but with results, with undeniable weight. Now they know. You weren't walking among them because you were one of them. You were among them because you were assigned there. But now that the test has come and the veil has lifted, they're starting to understand you were never equal. You were always chosen. You just didn't need to say it because heaven already did. Number 5, they thought it was a personality clash, but it was a collision of dimensions. They thought you rubbed them the wrong way because of your attitude, your confidence, or the way you carried yourself. They tried to box it in as a personality clash. But this was never about preferences or differences. This wasn't a disagreement. This was a dimensional disruption. Your spirit walked into rooms carrying authority they didn't have, and it shook what had been comfortably operating in them. You didn't provoke them with words. You provoked them just by existing. Your presence disturbed the atmosphere because what's inside you is not compatible with what's ruling them. You weren't at odds with the person. You were clashing with the spirit controlling the person. That's why their energy felt unstable. That's why they switched up out of nowhere. That's why the hatred seemed random and excessive. It wasn't random at all. Your spiritual frequency collided with their bondage, and instead of confronting their own chains, they projected their resistance onto you. When someone is aligned with darkness, knowingly or unknowingly, they will always be irritated by light. Your obedience irritated their rebellion. Your purity exposed their compromise. Your clarity threatened their confusion. Without saying a word, you disrupted their comfort zone. You didn't insult them, but your walk convicted them. That's the power of spiritual rank. It doesn't always show up as miracles or prophecy. Sometimes it just disrupts systems by walking in. And that's why the attacks didn't make sense. That's why you were being fought when you hadn't even started anything. The static you felt wasn't just tension, it was warfare. They were reacting to a realm they couldn't articulate. What they couldn't explain, they tried to destroy. But this was never personal. It was spiritual from day one. You showed up, and something ancient in them flared up. It wasn't you they hated. It was the light you brought, the order you carried, and the realm you represented. And no, it wasn't a clash of vibes. It was a collision of kingdoms. Number 6, they poked what they couldn't measure. They thought they had you figured out, thought you were just another soft-hearted, naive, easy-to-control person they could push, pull, and play with. To them, you looked like familiar prey, someone they could manipulate, provoke, and drain, like they've done with others before. But what they didn't know is that you're not standing where you are because of charm, popularity, or personality. You're standing there because you've been processed in places they've never survived. You've been promoted in realms they don't even believe exist. They poked at you expecting reactions. They wanted control. They wanted access. But what they touched was sacred ground. You're not a random soul. You are ranked. And that rank wasn't handed to you easily. It came from deep pain, from wilderness seasons that nearly killed you, from nights when you had no one but God and still chose obedience, from moments when you could have lashed out but kept silent, when you could have taken shortcuts but chose the slow burn of refinement. That's where your authority was built. They couldn't see it because spiritual rank isn't loud. It doesn't show up in selfies or status updates. It shows up in the spirit. And when you carry something from heaven, people who operate in the flesh will always underestimate you until the backlash hits them. They thought they were just playing a game. They didn't realize they were handling someone who's been commissioned by the Most High. Your oil wasn't bought. It was pressed out of seasons of betrayal, brokenness, sacrifice, and complete surrender. That's why their usual tricks didn't work. That's why their manipulation bounced back. You've outgrown the systems they're still trying to master. They didn't just test you. They crossed a line with someone heaven has already crowned in silence. Now they're confused by the fallout, but the truth is simple. They poked what they couldn't measure and touched power they were never authorized to handle. Number 7. Heaven doesn't reveal rank until hell makes the first move. Heaven doesn't parade rank the way the world does. There's no loud announcement, no spotlight, no spiritual resume handed out. When you're truly called, you're often hidden, kept low, quiet, and covered. Not because you're unworthy, but because real power is protected until the right time. And the right time often looks like warfare. God didn't reveal your rank at your peak. He revealed it in the fire. He let the enemy make the first move because that's when your authority had to show up. What looked like an attack was actually a divine setup. God allowed the challenge not to break you, but to introduce you. He used opposition as a stage to reveal what had been cultivated in the dark. That betrayal, that spiritual attack, that random chaos, they weren't just battles, they were announcements. You were hidden in plain sight until warfare forced the unveiling. And suddenly the same people who questioned your strength were seeing power they didn't even know you had. The enemy came in thinking you were unarmed, unaware, unranked. But the moment they pressed, the truth came out. You weren't just covered, you were commissioned, and heaven backed you, not with noise, but with undeniable movement. Situations shifted, atmospheres responded, attacks boomeranged. That wasn't coincidence, that was spiritual rank being recognized by both realms. God didn't stop the attack because the attack was necessary. It exposed who was really on your side. It revealed who was playing both sides. But most importantly, it revealed you. You didn't even fully know your weight until the pressure hit. And when it did, you didn't collapse. You activated. Because heaven doesn't need to prove its own. It waits for hell to try, then lets the fruit speak. So no, the battle wasn't a punishment. It was a revelation. And when it hit, so did your confirmation. You've been ranked, you've been trusted, and now you've been revealed. Number 8, their attack triggered divine retaliation because touching you was a violation. They didn't know who they were messing with. They thought they were just talking about you, plotting against you, throwing shade or curses like it was nothing. But in the spirit, what they did wasn't petty. It was illegal. There are levels of protection that come with being chosen, and one of them is spiritual law. When God sets someone apart, he marks them. That mark isn't symbolic, it's real. And it comes with consequences for anyone who crosses it. The moment they slandered you, manipulated you, betrayed you, or spoke death over your name, they violated something sacred. They thought it was just shade or strategy, but they touched something heaven had sealed. That's not a small offense. That's trespassing. And not just on your life, but on the assignment and the authority you carry. You're not just a person, you're a sanctuary. You've become a carrier of presence. And when someone attacks that without divine permission, there is retaliation, not from you, but from heaven itself. You didn't have to defend yourself because God already had legal grounds to act. The pushback they're facing now isn't just bad luck or coincidence, it's justice. It's heaven restoring balance. It's the spiritual realm enforcing consequences for breaking protocol. When they touched you, they disrupted the flow of something holy, and now it's correcting itself, not out of vengeance, but out of order. People forget that spiritual attacks have real-world consequences, especially when directed at someone aligned with divine purpose. You didn't earn this protection through pride. You inherited it through pain, surrender, obedience, and covenant. That's why the retaliation isn't loud or messy. It's precise, surgical, undeniable. What was aimed at you has bounced back with multiplied force, and they can't figure out why everything is falling apart. But you know, because touching you wasn't just disrespect, it was a violation of sacred ground, and heaven always responds to violations. Number 9, you were given the oil they tried to manufacture. They wanted what you carry, but they didn't want what it cost you. They wanted the oil, your wisdom, your strength, your peace, your influence, but they tried to skip the crushing. They thought they could mimic what was formed in you through pain by copying your style, quoting your words, or imitating your presence. But spiritual oil can't be faked. It can't be bought. It's produced in private places through experiences no one volunteers for. What they didn't see were the nights you broke down but didn't break away. The prayers you prayed when you had nothing left. The moments when you were surrounded by silence and still said, God, I trust you. They didn't witness the heartbreak that matured you, the rejection that sharpened your discernment, the spiritual warfare that trained your hands for battle. You didn't get here by accident, you were processed, and that process was brutal. Meanwhile, they tried to build influence without intimacy. They wanted the effect without the cost. They thought spiritual power came from performance. But you were chosen not because you were flashy, but because you were faithful. You stayed when others walked away. You served in obscurity. You forgave when it would have been easier to curse. You grew roots while they chased platforms. And now there's a weight on your life they can't replicate. That's why their version doesn't carry the same authority. That's why they sound good, but nothing shifts when they speak. Because you can't manufacture oil. It has to be pressed out of you. It comes through wilderness, surrender, obedience, and the kind of pruning that makes you cry out but not quit. You're not ranked because you're flawless. You're ranked because you didn't run from the fire. You didn't shortcut the suffering. You submitted to the process, and heaven honored it. That oil on your life isn't decoration, it's evidence, proof that you've been crushed, tested, refined, and approved. Number 10, your discernment isn't intuition, it's authority. They thought you were just good at reading the room, that you had sharp intuition or were just naturally observant. They assumed you were just one of those people who could sense vibes, pick up on energy, or spot liars, but they were way off. What you carry isn't basic perception, it's authority. You don't just guess things, you see them. You don't just feel tension, You discern spirits. What they call a gut feeling is actually spiritual clearance. You've been granted access to dimensions they're not even aware exist. Your discernment isn't emotional, it's legal. It didn't come from reading people, it came from reading the spirit behind them. You don't just pick up on tone or body language, you pick up on assignments, agendas, and hidden allegiances. That's why you can meet someone and immediately feel off. That's why someone's smile never fooled you. That's why you walk into certain rooms and your spirit flares up before anyone speaks. It's not paranoia, it's protocol. The Spirit of God in you scans everything for alignment, and that's what they never understood. They thought they could sneak their way in, perform, flatter, pretend, manipulate. But you saw them, spirit first. You saw the insecurity hiding behind confidence, the jealousy behind fake support, the manipulation hiding under charm. Because your discernment isn't something you learned, it's something you were given after surviving spiritual warfare. You earned it through fire, through betrayal, through learning how to hear God's voice above your own pain. They couldn't figure out how you always knew. They called it coincidence or even arrogance. But the truth is, when God gives you spiritual clearance, you're no longer guessing. You're guarding. You're not just reading people, you're reading the realm they serve. And that discernment, it's not for show, it's not for gossip, it's for protection, for strategy, for knowing when to speak and when to walk away. So no, you're not just intuitive, you're authorized. You're walking with spiritual documentation that grants you insight others will never access because you've been appointed and heaven trusts your vision. Number 11, you didn't just win, you shifted territories. You didn't just survive the attack, you didn't just win the battle. Something far greater happened. The entire landscape shifted because of your obedience. They thought it was just about you, that it was a personal issue, a one-on-one conflict. But what they didn't know is that when you stood your ground, territory was being claimed in the spirit. Every time you resisted the urge to retaliate in the flesh, every time you stayed in alignment with God instead of lashing out, you were advancing something they couldn't see. That wasn't just a win, that was a takeover. You broke through strongholds that had sat untouched for generations. You shut down demonic altars that had legal access to your bloodline. You disrupted spiritual patterns that used to keep your family, your region, your environment bound. Your obedience echoed. Your worship in the storm sent shockwaves. Your silence in the face of provocation wasn't weakness, it was warfare. And when you finally responded, it wasn't with flesh, it was with fire. Strategic, heaven-backed, territory-shifting fire. That's why the backlash was so intense. It wasn't just about you, it was about what you represent. The enemy saw you as a threat, not because you're loud, but because your alignment makes you dangerous. You walk into places and ownership changes, spiritual jurisdictions collapse, darkness loses its claim. You carry the kind of presence that forces principalities to retreat. So when they tested you, they triggered something far bigger than a personal fight. They activated a realm that had been waiting for a vessel bold enough to stand and shift. And because you didn't fold, because you fought spiritually, God honored it by releasing authority. Now that territory they once ruled, they no longer have access. Your win was heaven's declaration. This ground belongs to the kingdom now. Number 12, you're protected by hierarchies they don't even know exist. They thought you were outnumbered, that because they had a crowd, a plan, or a few hidden rituals, you were vulnerable. They thought the power of their gossip, curses, and manipulation could shake you. What they didn't realize is that while they were organizing in the natural, you were already fortified in the spirit. You're not just protected, you're covered by a hierarchy of divine order that their world has no language for. You weren't just walking around with good vibes or blind faith. You've been assigned supernatural backup, not just angels, but ranked angels, not just protection, but strategic protocols. There are realms of divine military structure that don't advertise themselves, but when someone touches a chosen one without clearance, those ranks activate. You don't have to summon them. They're already on watch. Because where you go, heaven assigns coverage based on your purpose, not your popularity. While they were lighting candles, chanting your name, or slandering you in rooms you never entered, heaven was issuing commands. While they tried to dig spiritual holes for you, unseen hands were blocking, reversing, and rerouting every strike. They couldn't understand why their attacks had no lasting effect, why the curses didn't stick. why your name stayed clean while theirs spiraled. It's because they were battling someone under divine protocol, a vessel backed by ranks that outrank principalities. This isn't fiction. It's structure. God doesn't assign destiny without assigning protection. And when your walk is aligned, that protection increases with the weight of your assignment. They looked at you and saw a target. Heaven looked at you and saw a secured zone, untouchable without permission. So while they think they've been moving in secret, they've actually been exposing themselves to realms they're not qualified to battle. You're not walking alone. You're walking under covering that reaches beyond dimensions, covered by a kingdom order they never even knew existed. That's why you're still standing. That's why you're untouchable, because heaven ranked you and hell wasn't ready. Number 13, they wanted smoke, but you brought fire from the throne room. They came at you with petty tactics, side comments, fake support, sneaky betrayal, manipulation dressed as kindness. They thought you'd respond on their level, that you'd clap back, argue, spiral or fold. They wanted smoke, drama, tension, chaos, but what they didn't expect was fire. Not emotional fire, not carnal rage. Fire from the throne room, the kind that doesn't just burn, it purifies. The kind that exposes what's hidden and shuts down every false altar in its path. They underestimated the depth of your lineage. What you carry didn't start with you. It was prayed into your bloodline by ancestors who cried out to God in secret. You walk with the weight of generational mantles, assignments and anointings passed down through pain, warfare and covenant. You're not just walking in your own strength. You're backed by heaven's thunder and history's groan. So when you respond, it's not petty, it's prophetic. You don't trade insults, you shift atmospheres, you don't chase rumors, you command peace. You don't get pulled into spiritual street fights. You call on the one who answers by fire. Your response carries authority, not emotion. When you speak, things move. When you pray, things break. When you worship, realms open. You don't just survive warfare, you reverse it. Because what's inside you has already been tested in silence, in wilderness, in weeping. Your fire wasn't lit yesterday, it's been burning through decades of obedience. They didn't expect their little strike to provoke divine retaliation. They didn't know that poking you meant disturbing something far greater, that their gossip would trigger angelic interference, that their curses would wake up a fire they couldn't put out. Because you're not ordinary, you've been ignited by something eternal. And when the time comes to respond, you don't match energy, you elevate it. They wanted smoke, but you brought fire that consumes and exposes, not because you're mad, but because you're mantled. Number 14. Your rank wasn't given for status. It was given for assignment. Your spiritual rank was never about status. It wasn't given so you could boast, compete, or walk around feeling superior. It was never about clout. God didn't promote you for applause. He promoted you for purpose. There is territory, spiritually, emotionally, generationally, that needed someone bold enough, clean enough, and surrendered enough to step in and take it back. That's why you were ranked. Not to be seen, but to shift. You were trusted with that level of authority because your assignment carries weight. There are atmospheres that don't change until you show up. There are patterns that stay in place until your voice breaks them. There are family curses, community strongholds, and generational dysfunctions that only lift when someone like you stands their ground. You weren't given this rank to wear it. You were given it to enforce it. God didn't choose you because you were the loudest or the most polished. He chose you because you could be trusted with fire. You could carry the oil and not idolize it. You could walk in power and still choose humility. And because of that, heaven assigned you places to occupy, not physically, but spiritually. You've been given clearance to tear down, to rebuild, to displace darkness, and to usher in divine order wherever your feet land. That's why your life has felt intense. That's why your warfare has been relentless. Because the enemy doesn't attack what isn't a threat. The level of your battle has always matched the size of your assignment, and now your ranking is proof that you didn't just survive, you qualified. You were processed through fire, through silence, through betrayal, and still came out aligned. So no, your rank isn't decoration, it's authorization, a divine mandate to interrupt hell's agenda, take ground for the kingdom, and make sure that God's will isn't just known, it's enforced. You weren't raised up for attention, you were raised up for impact. They had no idea what they were stepping into when they tested you. They saw the exterior, misunderstood the silence, and misread your humility. What they didn't realize was that you were never just a person. You were a mandate. You were ranked by heaven, not for vanity, but for victory, not to be praised, but to be positioned. Every attack against you was more than just a test of your character. It was a trigger that activated the realm backing you. You weren't hiding, you were being hidden, walking silently with weight that could collapse lesser vessels. When they poked you, they didn't just stir emotion. They awakened divine retaliation. They broke spiritual law, crossed boundaries they didn't understand, and found out too late that you don't fight like them. You war with the fire of the throne room. This was never about drama. This was about dimension. Kingdoms collided the moment they stepped out of order. And while they thought they were coming for a person, they were actually confronting an established authority. You didn't just win battles. You shifted territories, dismantled altars, enforced divine justice, and disrupted generational patterns. What you carry isn't personality, it's spiritual jurisdiction, and now the atmosphere knows it. The enemy knows it. The people who tested you definitely know it. Your silence was never weakness, it was strategy. Your calm wasn't fear, it was fire on reserve. You were underestimated because they couldn't see the encounters, the process, or the oil. But now, your rank has been revealed. You didn't just survive the test, you exposed the spiritual structure behind it, and you walked out not just victorious, but enthroned. If this message spoke to your spirit, if it confirmed what you've been feeling but couldn't explain, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video to let the enemy know you're still standing. Comment below and declare, I've been ranked for a reason. Share this with someone who's been battling in silence and needs to be reminded of who they truly are in the spirit. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because this isn't just content, this is confirmation. This is a spiritual hub for the chosen, the called, and the rising remnant. Your journey isn't random, your battles weren't in vain, and your authority is real. Let's continue walking this path together, in truth, in fire, and in full alignment with heaven. Stay tuned, stay covered, and never forget, you were hidden but never forsaken. Welcome to your revealing season.